In just 20 years, one continent was carved up like a piece of meat. No war was declared, no African king signed a single paper, yet by 1914 almost all of Africa belonged to Europe. This is not the story your textbook told you. This is the real story, and it starts with a secret meeting in Berlin. Most people have heard the phrase "Scramble for Africa." Almost nobody knows the full story behind it. By the end of this video, 3 things will be clear: who started it, how it happened so fast, and why the real reason behind it is rarely taught in school. There is one detail that explains why a map drawn in a German city in 1884 still causes wars in Africa today, and that detail is coming. The story begins not with a battle, but with something far quieter, and in some ways far more dangerous. But first, if uncovering the story's history class skipped sounds interesting, subscribe now, because what is about to be shown only gets darker. Before any of this began, Africa was not empty land waiting to be found. In the early 1800s, the continent was home to large, organized kingdoms and empires. The Sokoto Caliphate ruled across parts of West Africa with its own laws and scholars. The Ashanti Empire controlled trade routes built on gold. The Zulu Kingdom in the south had a powerful army and a structured government. In the east, Ethiopia stood as an ancient Christian kingdom with a history stretching back over 1,000 years. Further south, the stone walls of Great Zimbabwe still stood as proof of a sophisticated trading civilization that had thrived centuries earlier. In what is now Nigeria, the Kingdom of Benin was famous across the world for its bronze plaques and skilled craftsmen, with a royal court that had traded with Portugal since the 1400s. These were not simple villages. They were nations with armies, courts, markets, and centuries of history, written and spoken. Africa also held something Europe desperately wanted: gold, ivory, palm oil, rubber, diamonds. For centuries, Europe had tried to push deeper into the continent and failed. Tropical disease killed soldiers before they ever fired a shot. African kingdoms were strong enough and organized enough to push invaders back. Europe wanted Africa, but Africa was not easy to take. Then 2 things changed everything: a new weapon called the Maxim gun, capable of firing hundreds of rounds a minute, and a drug called quinine, which treated malaria and let European soldiers survive deep inland for the first time. The balance of power was about to shift, and almost nobody outside a few government offices in Europe knew it was happening. What happened next did not take place on a battlefield. It happened in a quiet room around a polished table, far away from a single African shore. In 1884, the German leader Otto von Bismarck invited the major powers of Europe to a conference in Berlin. 14 countries sent representatives: Britain, France, Germany, Portugal, Belgium, Italy, and others. Not a single African leader was invited. Not a single African voice was in that room. The meetings stretched on for months, ending in early 1885, and what came out of them was a set of rules for how Europe would divide an entire continent among themselves. One rule shocked the world even at the time. A country could claim African land simply by proving effective occupation. A flag, a fort, a trading post, that was enough. The final agreement, known as the General Act of Berlin, also declared free trade and free navigation along the Congo and Niger rivers, language that sounded fair on paper, but in practice simply guaranteed every European power easy access to the resources flowing out of the continent. Men sitting at tables in a cold European city took out rulers and drew straight lines across rivers, mountains, deserts, and entire communities, often without knowing who lived there or how those people were connected by language, family, or tradition. While African families were eating dinner, working their land, and living ordinary lives, their entire future was being decided on paper in a country most of them would never see. The numbers tell the story better than any speech could. In 1870, Europeans controlled about 10% of Africa. By 1914, that number had jumped to roughly 90%. France took huge stretches of West and North Africa. Britain claimed territory running from Egypt down toward South Africa, chasing a dream some British leaders openly called a railway from Cape to Cairo. Portugal held on to Angola and Mozambique. Germany took Cameroon, Togoland, German East Africa, and German South Africa. Italy moved into Libya and parts of the Horn of Africa. By the time the dividing was finished, only 2 countries on the entire continent remained free of European rule: Ethiopia, which had fought for it, and Liberia, founded earlier by freed American slaves. In less than 50 years, an entire continent changed hands, and the people who lived there were never asked. Nowhere did this go darker than in the Congo. King Leopold II of Belgium personally claimed a territory roughly the size of Western Europe and named it the Congo Free State. He never once set foot there. Publicly, he claimed his mission was civilization, science, and protection from the slave trade. Privately, his agents forced local people to harvest wild rubber under brutal quotas, using terror to enforce the system. The demand for rubber was exploding across Europe and America at the time, driven by the new craze for bicycle tires, and soon after, automobile tires, and the Congo's wild vines became one of the most profitable sources on Earth. A private army called the Force Publique was sent to enforce collection. Villages that failed to meet their quota faced beatings. Women and children were taken hostage to force men back into the forest to collect more rubber. Mutilation was used both as punishment and as proof sent back to superiors that discipline was being maintained. Historians still debate the exact number of lives lost, but the scale is widely recognized as catastrophic, with population losses across the Congo region running into the millions through violence, disease, and forced labor combined. For years, the world barely noticed. Then a small number of people refused to stay silent. An English shipping clerk named E.D. Morrell began publishing reports exposing the brutality after noticing something strange in the shipping records he worked with. Ships sailed to the Congo loaded with guns and chains and sailed back loaded with valuable rubber, yet almost nothing was ever paid for it. That pattern told him forced labor was the only explanation. An American writer named George Washington Williams traveled to the Congo and documented what he saw firsthand. Missionaries sent photographs home that newspapers could not ignore. Public pressure built until in 1908, Leopold was finally forced to hand control of the Congo over to the Belgian government. The damage by then was already done. Leopold never visited the land he destroyed, and even today some statues of him still stand in parts of Belgium, a quiet reminder of how easily history can be only half told. The Congo was not the only place where colonization turned into mass killing. In German Southwest Africa, what is now Namibia, the Herero and Nama people rose up against German settlers in 1904 after years of land seizure and broken promises. The German commander, General Lothar von Trotha, responded with an order that any Herero found within the colony's borders, armed or not, would be shot on sight. Survivors were driven into the desert where many died of thirst and starvation, and thousands more were forced into concentration camps where forced labor, disease, and abuse killed a large share of those held there. Historians today widely describe these events as the first genocide of the 20th century, carried out years before the term genocide even existed. But Africa was never simply silent during any of this. In 1896, at the Battle of Adwa, Ethiopia, led by Emperor Menelik II, met an invading Italian army and defeated it decisively. It remains one of the only times during this entire period that an African nation stopped a European colonial conquest outright, and Ethiopia stayed independent through the rest of the Scramble, a victory still celebrated across the continent today. Italy's humiliation at Adwa was so deeply felt that it would later return as a motive for revenge, helping drive a second, far larger invasion of Ethiopia decades afterward, in 1935, under a different Italian leader entirely. In German East Africa, between 1905 and 1907, thousands of fighters from different ethnic groups united in what became known as the Maji Maji Rebellion, named for the Swahili word for water. A spiritual leader named Kinjikatel Ngwale distributed a sacred water he claimed would turn German bullets harmless. It did not. German forces crushed the uprising with extreme violence, and on top of the fighting, colonial troops deliberately burned fields and destroyed food supplies to starve resistance out of the population. The famine and warfare that followed killed an enormous number of people, with estimates running into the hundreds of thousands. In West Africa, a military leader named Samiri Touré built his own empire and even set up workshops to repair and copy modern rifles, fighting French expansion for nearly 2 decades before he was finally captured in 1898. And years earlier, in 1879, the Zulu kingdom delivered a stunning defeat to British forces at the Battle of Isandlwana, killing well over 1,000 soldiers in a single day, even though the wider war eventually went against them. Resistance was real, it was organized, it was brave. African armies fought with spears, older rifles, and disciplined tactics built over generations, but they were facing opponents armed with machine guns, telegraphs, and steamships. In most of these conflicts, it was not courage that decided the outcome, it was technology. So why is so little of this taught? The official story, told for generations, was that Europe was bringing civilization to Africa. The real story is far less noble. European factories needed raw materials. European businesses needed new markets to sell their goods. Further south, the discovery of diamonds at Kimberley and gold on the Witwatersrand turned southern Africa into one of the richest prizes on the continent. And businessmen like Cecil Rhodes built private companies with their own armies to seize land and minerals in the name of profit and empire at the same time. Rhodes's British South Africa Company held a royal charter that let it act almost like a government, raising its own police force and pushing borders north into land that would later be named Rhodesia after Rhodes himself. European nations, locked in rivalry with one another, wanted the prestige of owning colonies, almost as a competition for status. The idea that this was a moral mission came after the decision to conquer, not before it. At the time, a flawed and racist set of ideas, often dressed up as science, was used to convince European publics that this conquest was natural, even good. It was not natural. It was a choice made by a small number of powerful men for reasons that had very little to do with the people whose lives it changed forever. Even now, the lines drawn in that Berlin meeting room have barely changed. Many of the borders that exist on the African map today are the same lines drawn by people who had never set foot on the land they were dividing. Ethnic groups were split apart. Rival groups were forced together under one flag. In some colonies, administrators went further still, issuing identity cards that hardened soft, fluid ethnic lines into fixed categories of us and them. In Rwanda, decisions made first by German and later by Belgian colonial administrators to favor one group over another in education and government hardened divisions that exploded into genocide decades after independence. Many of the conflicts that still make headlines today can be traced, in part, directly back to decisions made over maps and key in 1884 and 1885. Most African nations did not gain independence until the 1950s and 1960s, which means the colonial period directly shaped the governments, economies, and borders that exist right now. Patterns of extraction set up during the Scramble, minerals, oil, and cash crops shipped out for the benefit of others, still echo in trade relationships today, where many African economies continue to export raw resources rather than finished goods, a structure first put in place to serve European industry, not African development. The scramble for Africa itself lasted only about 30 decades. Its consequences are still being written more than 100 years later. History was not silent about Africa. It was simply never asked to speak. From the kingdoms that stood before the storm, to the secret meeting in Berlin, to the horror of the Congo, to the desert camps of Namibia, to the wars of resistance fought from Adwa to Isandlwana, to the real reasons hidden behind all of it, this is a story that deserves to be told in full, not in pieces. A map drawn by men who never set foot on the land still shapes lives today. And that is the part most history lessons leave out entirely. If this is the first time hearing the complete version of this story, share it with one person who only ever learned the textbook version. And subscribe for the next hidden history, because the truth, once uncovered, deserves to be remembered.